Sarah Martinez walked into the crowded community center with the same quiet confidence she had carried through 12 years of military service. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a plain blue sweater that did nothing to hint at the extraordinary life she had lived. The monthly Veterans Support Group meeting was already underway, with about 30 people sitting in a circle of folding chairs. She had been attending these meetings for 3 months now, ever since moving back to her hometown of Cedar Falls after her medical retirement from the Navy. Most people assumed she had been a desk clerk or maybe worked in logistics. Sarah never corrected them. She preferred it that way. The less attention she drew to herself, the better she could focus on helping others transition back to civilian life. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the group facilitator, noticed Sarah entering and gave her a warm smile. "Sarah, please take a seat wherever you're comfortable." The older woman had been running these sessions for over a decade and had a gift for making even the most reluctant veterans feel welcome. Sarah chose an empty chair near the back next to Tom Bradley, a former Army mechanic who had become something of a friend over the past few months. Tom had lost his left leg to an IED in Afghanistan and struggled with phantom pain that kept him awake most nights. Despite his own challenges, he always made an effort to check on the newer members of the group. "How's the new job going?" Tom whispered as Sarah settled into her chair. She had recently started working as a nurse at Cedar Falls General Hospital, though she had downplayed her extensive medical training when she applied for the position. "It's good," Sarah replied softly, her eyes scanning the room. Even in this safe space, old habits died hard. She automatically noted the exits, counted the people, and assessed potential threats. It was exhausting sometimes, but her mind seemed incapable of shutting off those instincts. The current discussion centered around Mike Peterson, a Marine veteran who had been struggling with nightmares since returning from his 3rd deployment to Iraq. His hands shook slightly as he spoke about the guilt he felt for surviving when so many of his brothers hadn't made it home. Several other veterans nodded in understanding, sharing similar feelings of survivor's guilt. Sarah listened intently, her heart aching for Mike. She recognized the pain in his voice, the way his shoulders tensed when he talked about combat. She had seen that same look in the mirror too many times to count. But she remained silent, as she always did during these discussions. Her own experiences felt too heavy, too complex to share in this setting. Dr. Walsh guided the conversation with practiced skill, helping Mike explore his feelings without pushing too hard. The room felt safe and supportive, filled with people who understood the unique challenges of military service. Yet Sarah still felt like an outsider, carrying secrets that seemed too dark to bring into the light. As the meeting progressed, other veterans shared their stories. Jenny Rodriguez talked about adjusting to civilian work after serving as a military police officer. David Kim discussed his struggles with hypervigilance and how crowds still made him nervous. Each story was met with understanding nods and words of encouragement. Sarah found herself thinking about her own journey. Her transition out of the military hadn't been by choice. A roadside bomb in Syria had ended her career abruptly, leaving her with a traumatic brain injury and shrapnel scars she kept hidden beneath her clothes. The physical wounds had healed, but the emotional ones remained raw. She thought about the faces of the soldiers she had treated in field hospitals across 3 different combat zones. The young Marine who had bled out in her arms despite her best efforts. The Army sergeant who had looked at her with such gratitude after she had saved his life during a mortar attack. The Navy corpsman who had worked alongside her during a mass casualty event that had lasted 18 hours straight. Those memories felt too intense for this quiet room in Cedar Falls. These were good people, struggling with their own demons, and Sarah didn't want to burden them with the weight of her experiences. She had learned long ago to compartmentalize, to keep her darkest memories locked away where they couldn't hurt anyone else. The meeting began to wind down as Dr. Walsh reminded everyone about the upcoming community barbecue. It was meant to help veterans connect with their neighbors and build stronger relationships in the community. Sarah had already decided she wouldn't attend. Large gatherings still made her uncomfortable, and she preferred to keep her military service private. As people began to file out of the community center, Tom turned to her with concern in his eyes. "You seem more quiet than usual tonight. Everything okay?" Sarah managed a small smile. "Just tired from work. Long shift yesterday. It wasn't entirely a lie." She had worked a 12-hour shift at the hospital, but her exhaustion ran much deeper than physical fatigue. Tom nodded, understanding. If you ever want to talk, you know I'm here, right? Sometimes it helps to share the load. Sarah appreciated his kindness, but she couldn't imagine opening up about her past. How could she explain that she had been one of the few female Navy SEALs to serve in direct combat roles, that she had seen and done things that most people couldn't comprehend? The weight of those experiences felt too heavy to share. As she walked to her car in the parking lot, Sarah reflected on the evening. She genuinely cared about the other veterans in the group and wanted to help them heal, but she wasn't ready to reveal her own story, not yet. Maybe not ever. The drive home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls gave her time to decompress. This small town was so different from the war zones where she had spent most of her adult life. Here, the biggest crisis was usually a fender bender or a power outage. It should have felt peaceful, but sometimes the normalcy felt almost surreal after everything she had witnessed. 3 weeks had passed since the last support group meeting when Sarah received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Walsh. She was just finishing her morning coffee before heading to her shift at the hospital, when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I hope I'm not calling too early," Dr. Walsh began, her voice carrying an unusual urgency. "I have a situation and I think you might be able to help." Sarah set down her mug, immediately alert. "What's going on?" "It's Mike Peterson from our group. He had a severe episode last night and ended up in the emergency room. His wife called me this morning and she's really scared. The doctors want to transfer him to the psychiatric ward, but he's refusing treatment. He's asking specifically for you." This caught Sarah completely off guard. She had barely spoken to Mike during the meetings, maintaining her usual quiet presence in the background. "Me? Why would he ask for me?" "I'm not entirely sure," Dr. Walsh admitted. "But his wife mentioned that Mike said you were the only one in the group who really understood. He told her that he could see it in your eyes during the meetings. Sarah, I know you prefer to keep your service private, but this man is in crisis. Would you be willing to visit him?" Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the familiar tension building in her shoulders. She had worked so hard to maintain her anonymity, to keep her past buried, but the thought of a fellow veteran suffering alone made her decision easier than she expected. "Which hospital?" she asked quietly. "Cedar Falls General. He's in the emergency department, bed 7. His wife Amanda is with him." Sarah arrived at the hospital 20 minutes later, still wearing her civilian clothes since her shift didn't start for another hour. She had walked these halls countless times as a nurse, but approaching the emergency department as a visitor felt different. Her hands were slightly damp with nervous sweat. She found bed 7 easily enough. Mike Peterson sat on the edge of the hospital bed, his face pale and drawn. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept in days. His wife Amanda, a petite blonde woman in her 30s, sat in the plastic chair beside him, holding his hand tightly. "Mike," Sarah said softly, stepping around the curtain. "Dr. Walsh called me." "How are you doing?" Mike looked up at her with relief flooding his features. "Sarah, I was hoping you'd come." His voice was hoarse, as if he had been shouting or crying for hours. Amanda stood up quickly. "You must be Sarah. Thank you so much for coming. Mike has been asking for you since they brought him in." Sarah pulled up another chair and sat down across from Mike. "What happened?" Mike's hands trembled as he ran them through his hair. "I had another nightmare, but this one was different. More real. I could smell the smoke, hear the screaming. When I woke up, I couldn't tell where I was. Amanda found me in the backyard at 3 in the morning, digging with my bare hands. I thought I was trying to reach Martinez." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Martinez had been a common enough name in the military, but something in Mike's voice suggested this was more specific. "Tell me about Martinez," Sarah said gently. "Lance Corporal Roberto Martinez, kid from Phoenix, 22 years old. We were on patrol when the IED went off. He was thrown about 30 feet from the vehicle, and when we reached him," Mike's voice broke. "There was so much blood. I tried to help him, but I didn't know what to do. I'm a mechanic, not a medic. I just held pressure on the wound and kept telling him he was going to be okay." Sarah felt her chest tighten. She had treated countless soldiers named Martinez over the years, but one face suddenly became crystal clear in her memory. A young Marine with kind eyes and a picture of his girlfriend taped inside his helmet. "Was he conscious when you found him?" Sarah asked carefully. "Yeah, for a while. He kept asking for water, but we couldn't give him any because of his injuries. He talked about his girlfriend Maria, how he was going to propose when he got home. He made me promise to tell her he loved her if something happened. Tears were streaming down Mike's face now. He died in my arms, Sarah. I felt his heart stop beating and there was nothing I could do. Amanda squeezed her husband's hand. This is the first time he's been able to talk about it in detail. Usually when he has an episode, he just shuts down completely. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing what Mike had shared. She remembered that day clearly now. It had been during her second deployment, and they had received multiple casualties from an IED attack. One of them had been a young Marine who had arrived at the field hospital barely clinging to life. Mike, Sarah said slowly, what day did this happen? September 15th, 2019. Why? Sarah's heart began to race. What was Martinez's blood type? Mike looked confused by the question. Oh, negative, I think. The medics mentioned it when they were trying to get him ready for transport. Why does that matter? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything. Because I remember him. I remember Lance Corporal Roberto Martinez. The room went completely silent. Mike stared at her in shock while Amanda's mouth fell open. You were there? Mike whispered. I was the medic who treated him when he arrived at the forward surgical unit. We worked on him for 6 hours straight. Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands were trembling slightly. Mike, you did everything right. The pressure you applied to his wound kept him alive long enough to reach us. Without your first aid, he would have died on that road. Mike's face crumpled as the weight of Sarah's words hit him, but he still died. I wasn't enough to save him. No, Sarah said firmly. You gave him a chance. You gave us time to try. Martinez coded twice on the operating table, and we brought him back both times. He was conscious for about 10 minutes before the end, and you know what he said? Mike shook his head, unable to speak. He said a Marine named Mike had held his hand and promised to deliver a message to Maria. He asked me to make sure Mike knew that he was grateful, that having someone care about him in those last moments on the road meant everything. The silence in the emergency room bed 7 stretched for what felt like eternity. Mike Peterson stared at Sarah with wide eyes as if seeing her for the first time. His wife Amanda looked between them, clearly trying to process what she had just heard. You were a medic? Mike finally managed to whisper. Sarah nodded slowly, feeling years of carefully maintained walls beginning to crumble. Navy corpsman attached to Marine units. 3 deployments between 2018 and 2021. But you're so young, Amanda said softly. How long were you in the service? 12 years. I enlisted when I was 18. Sarah's voice was quiet but steady. She had kept these details buried for so long that speaking them aloud felt strange. Mike leaned forward in his hospital bed. Sarah, what you just told me about Martinez. Is it really true? He mentioned me? Every word of it. Roberto Martinez fought harder to stay alive than almost any patient I ever treated. He coded twice, and both times he came back fighting. During that 10-minute window when he was conscious, he was worried about you. He kept saying, Mike tried to save me, Mike did good. He wanted to make sure you knew that. Tears were streaming down Mike's face. But for the first time since Sarah had known him, they seemed to be tears of relief rather than anguish. I've been carrying this guilt for over 2 years, thinking I failed him, that I should have done more. You did exactly what you were supposed to do, Sarah said firmly. You provided immediate trauma care under fire. You kept him calm and conscious. You held his hand when he was scared. Mike, you were his lifeline. Amanda reached over and squeezed Sarah's arm. Thank you. I don't think you understand how much this means to us. Mike has been torturing himself over this for so long. Sarah felt a familiar ache in her chest. She had seen this pattern so many times during her service. Good people carrying guilt that didn't belong to them, punishing themselves for circumstances beyond their control. Mike, can I tell you something else about that day? Sarah asked. When we got the call about incoming casualties, we had already been operating for 14 straight hours. Our supplies were running low and we were exhausted. But when your convoy called in the medevac for Martinez, they also mentioned that a Marine named Mike had performed outstanding first aid under enemy fire. That information helped us prepare for his specific injuries before he even arrived. Mike looked up sharply. They said that? The pilot specifically mentioned that the patient had been stabilized by a Marine with exceptional field skills. That advance information probably saved us 20 minutes of diagnostic time. In trauma surgery, 20 minutes can be everything. The curtain around bed 7 suddenly moved, and a familiar face peered in. Dr. Rebecca Torres. The attending physician Sarah worked under looked surprised to see her there in civilian clothes. "Sarah, I thought your shift didn't start until noon," Dr. Torres said, then noticed the emotional conversation taking place. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt." "Dr. Torres, this is my friend Mike Peterson and his wife Amanda," Sarah said quickly. "Mike, Dr. Torres is one of the best emergency physicians I've ever worked with." Dr. Torres stepped into the small space, her expression professional but kind. "Mr. Peterson, how are you feeling? I understand you had a difficult night." Mike wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Actually, I'm feeling better than I have in months. Sarah has been helping me understand some things about my military service." Dr. Torres looked at Sarah with obvious curiosity. In the 6 months they had worked together, Sarah had never mentioned her military background beyond saying she had been a Navy nurse. The emotional intensity of the current situation clearly suggested there was more to the story. "Well, whatever you're discussing seems to be having a positive effect," Dr. Torres observed. "Your vitals have improved significantly since this morning," Amanda spoke up. "Dr. Mike was asking about being discharged. He's feeling much more stable now, and honestly, this conversation with Sarah has helped more than anything the psychiatrist said last night." Dr. Torres looked at Mike carefully. "I'd like to keep you for observation for a few more hours, just to make sure this improvement is sustained. But if you continue to feel this stable, we can probably discharge you this afternoon with outpatient follow-up." After Dr. Torres left, Mike turned back to Sarah. "I have to ask you something, and I hope you don't mind. During our group meetings, I always felt like you were holding something back, something big. Was I right?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, weighing her words. Military service affects everyone differently. Some experiences are easier to talk about than others. "But yours were particularly difficult," Amanda said gently. "It wasn't really a question?" "Yes," Sarah admitted. "They were." Mike leaned back against his pillows, studying Sarah's face. "I've been in that support group for 8 months, and I've never seen anyone who looked like they understood as much as you do. The way you listen to people's stories like you've seen it all before." "I've seen a lot," Sarah said simply. "More than the rest of us?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Every veteran's experience was valid, regardless of their role or location. She never wanted to minimize anyone's service, but Mike's direct question deserved an honest answer. "Different," she said finally. "Not more important, but different." Mike nodded slowly. "I respect that you don't want to talk about it. But Sarah, what you've shared with me today, it's given me my life back. For the first time in 2 years, I don't feel like a failure." "You were never a failure," Sarah said quietly. "You were a Marine doing his job under impossible circumstances. Roberto Martinez was lucky to have you there with him." Amanda stood up and walked around the bed to where Sarah was sitting. Without warning, she wrapped her arms around Sarah in a fierce hug. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me my husband back." Sarah stiffened slightly at the unexpected contact, then slowly relaxed into the embrace. She couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged her with such genuine gratitude. When Amanda stepped back, Mike was watching them with something that looked like hope in his eyes for the first time since Sarah had known him. "Will you still come to the support group meetings?" he asked. "I think there might be other people there who could benefit from hearing your perspective." Sarah felt that familiar tension returning to her shoulders. "Mike, I appreciate what you're saying, but I'm not ready to share my experiences with the whole group." "I understand," Mike said quickly. "I'm not asking you to tell your whole story. But maybe just knowing that you're there and that you've been through similar things, it might help other people feel less alone." 2 days after her conversation with Mike Peterson, Sarah walked into the Veterans Support Group meeting with a different energy than usual. Word had somehow spread that she had helped Mike through his crisis, and several people approached her before the session began. Jenny Rodriguez, the former military police officer, was the first to speak. "Mike told us what happened at the hospital. I just wanted to say thank you for being there for him." David Kim nodded in agreement. "Mike seems like a different person. Whatever you said to him really made a difference." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the attention, but she managed to smile and nod politely. Mike did the hard work himself. He just needed to hear a different perspective on his experience. As the group settled into their circle, Sarah noticed Dr. Walsh watching her with curious eyes. The facilitator had obviously heard about the hospital visit, but was waiting for Sarah to share what she was comfortable revealing. "Before we begin tonight," Dr. Walsh said, I want to acknowledge that this community of veterans continues to show up for each other in meaningful ways. Mike, would you like to share how you're feeling? Mike Peterson looked better than Sarah had seen him in months. His posture was straighter, his eyes clearer, and there was a calmness about him that hadn't been there before. I'm doing much better, Mike said. I had a breakthrough a few days ago that helped me understand something I've been struggling with for over 2 years. Sometimes we carry guilt about things that aren't actually our fault, and sometimes it takes hearing from someone who was actually there to help us see the truth. He glanced at Sarah briefly, but didn't elaborate further. She appreciated his discretion. That's wonderful to hear, Dr. Walsh replied. Growth often happens when we can reframe our experiences through new information or perspectives. The discussion moved on to other topics, but Sarah found herself paying attention to the stories being shared with fresh ears. Tom Bradley talked about his ongoing struggles with phantom pain, but also mentioned that he had started volunteering at a local adaptive sports program for disabled veterans. Jenny Rodriguez shared that she was having trouble sleeping because of hypervigilance, especially when her husband worked night shifts and she was alone in the house. She had installed multiple security systems but still found herself checking locks and windows. Repeatedly, David Kim discussed his difficulty maintaining relationships because he had trouble trusting new people. He had been seeing a woman for 6 months but was afraid to let her get too close because he worried about having flashbacks or episodes in front of her. As Sarah listened to each story, she began to see patterns and connections she hadn't noticed before. Many of their struggles stemmed from the same root issues she had dealt with. The hypervigilance, the trust issues, the survivor guilt, the difficulty transitioning from high-stakes military environments to civilian normalcy. Sarah, Dr. Walsh said gently, you've been very thoughtful tonight. Any reflections you'd like to share? Sarah looked around the circle at these people who had become familiar faces over the past few months. They were good people, struggling with challenges that she understood all too well. She thought about Mike's improvement after their conversation and wondered if her perspective might help others too. I've been thinking about something, Sarah said slowly, about how we sometimes isolate ourselves because we think our experiences are too different or too difficult for other people to understand. The room was completely quiet, waiting for her to continue. But sometimes the experiences that feel too heavy to share are exactly the ones that might help someone else feel less alone. Sarah's voice was steady but soft. I've been keeping parts of my military service private because I thought they were too intense for this setting. But listening to everyone tonight, I realized that maybe that's not serving anyone well. Dr. Walsh leaned forward slightly. What kinds of experiences are you referring to, if you're comfortable sharing? Sarah took a deep breath. This was harder than treating casualties under fire, harder than making split-second medical decisions in combat zones. This was about vulnerability, and that had never been her strength. I was a Navy corpsman attached to Marine units for 3 deployments, she began. I spent most of my time in forward operating bases and field hospitals, treating combat casualties. I saw a lot of things that were difficult to process, Jenny Rodriguez spoke up. That must have been incredibly stressful. I can't imagine the pressure of trying to save lives under those conditions. It was, Sarah acknowledged, but it was also the most meaningful work I've ever done. The difficulty wasn't just the medical challenges. It was carrying the weight of all those individual stories, all those soldiers who trusted me with their lives. Tom Bradley shifted in his chair. I think about the medics who worked on me after I was injured. I never got to thank them properly. They probably saved my life, and I don't even know their names. That's the thing, Sarah said. We all did our jobs, but we didn't always get closure. I treated hundreds of soldiers over those deployments, and most of the time, I never found out what happened to them after they left my care. Did they survive? Did they recover fully? Did they make it home to their families? David Kim nodded slowly. I've wondered the same thing about the people I served with. We scattered to different units, different bases, different lives. You lose track of people who were incredibly important to you during deployment. Sarah felt something loosening in her chest. These people did understand. Their experiences might have been different from hers, but the emotional aftermath was remarkably similar. There's something else, Sarah continued. The transition back to civilian life was harder than I expected. I went from an environment where life and death decisions were routine to a place where the biggest emergency might be someone running late for an appointment. The adjustment was jarring. Yes, Jenny Rodriguez exclaimed. I felt the same way. Going from military police work to a civilian office job felt like moving to a different planet. Everything seemed so trivial. Dr. Walsh watched this exchange with obvious satisfaction. "Sarah, it sounds like you're finding some common ground with others in the group." "I am," Sarah admitted. "I think I've been underestimating how much we all have in common, regardless of our specific military occupational specialties." Mike Peterson had been listening intently to this conversation. "Sarah, can I ask you something personal?" She nodded. "When you were treating casualties, did you ever feel like you had to be strong for everyone else, even when you were struggling inside?" Sarah felt a familiar ache in her throat. "Every single day." "And did you ever feel like you couldn't show vulnerability because people were depending on you?" "Yes. That's exactly how I felt in my unit. I was the mechanic, so everyone depended on me to keep their vehicles running, keep them safe on the road. I felt like I had to be the rock, the problem solver, even when I was falling apart inside." Sarah looked around the circle and saw nods of recognition from several other members. She was beginning to understand that her experiences, while specific to her role, were part of a larger pattern that many veterans shared. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah began opening up to the support group, and the dynamic of the meetings had shifted noticeably. More veterans were attending, word having spread through the local military community that the sessions had become more substantive and helpful. On this particular evening, the group had grown to nearly 40 people, requiring them to move to the larger meeting room at the community center. Sarah arrived to find clusters of veterans talking quietly among themselves, creating a buzz of conversation she hadn't experienced in previous meetings. "Sarah," Dr. Walsh approached her as she entered the room. "I wanted to speak with you before we begin. We have some new members tonight, including a few who specifically asked to attend after hearing about the support you provided to Mike and others." Sarah felt her familiar anxiety spike. "Dr. Walsh, I hope people aren't expecting me to be some kind of expert or counselor. I'm just another veteran trying to figure things out." "Of course," Dr. Walsh reassured her. "But your willingness to share your medical background has given others permission to be more open about their own experiences. It's created a ripple effect of honesty that's quite powerful." As the meeting began, Sarah noticed several new faces in the expanded circle. A woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Colonel Patricia Hayes, recently retired from the Air Force. A young man named Marcus Chen, who had served as an Army explosive ordnance disposal specialist. An older gentleman, Frank Williams, who had been a Vietnam-era Navy pilot. Dr. Walsh guided the introductions, and Sarah was struck by the diversity of experiences represented in the room. These weren't just combat veterans, but people who had served in intelligence, logistics, aviation, engineering, and dozens of other specialties across all branches of service. "Tonight I'd like to focus on something we haven't discussed much in previous sessions," Dr. Walsh began, "the question of identity transition. Many veterans struggle with the shift from military identity to civilian identity. Sarah, would you be willing to start us off by sharing your thoughts on this topic?" Sarah felt 38 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and for a moment the attention was overwhelming. But as she looked around the circle, she saw faces filled with genuine interest rather than judgment. "Identity transition was something I really wasn't prepared for," Sarah began. "For 12 years I knew exactly who I was. I was Petty Officer Martinez, Navy Corpsman, combat medic. That identity came with clear expectations, clear responsibilities, clear measures of success." Marcus Chen, the EOD specialist, leaned forward. "I felt the same way. In the military, I was the bomb guy. Everyone knew what that meant, what I brought to the team. Out here, when people ask what I used to do, I say Army, and they just nod and move on." "Exactly," Sarah continued. "The civilian world doesn't really have equivalent roles for what many of us did in the military. I'm working as a nurse now, which uses some of my medical skills, but it's nothing like being a combat medic. The stakes are different, the environment is different, the relationships with patients are different." Colonel Hayes spoke up. "I spent 28 years in the Air Force, the last 8 as a wing commander. I was responsible for thousands of personnel and million-dollar aircraft. Now I'm substitute teaching high school math. The skills don't translate, and neither does the sense of purpose." Frank Williams, the Vietnam veteran, nodded slowly. "I've been out of the Navy for 40 years, and I still sometimes introduce myself by my rank and service. It was such a defining part of who I was, especially during a controversial time in our history." Tom Bradley shifted in his wheelchair. For me, losing my leg forced me to rebuild my identity twice. First from soldier to veteran, then from able-bodied to disabled. Both transitions were harder than I expected. Sarah found herself thinking about her own journey. I think part of what makes this transition difficult is that military service, especially in combat roles, gives you a very clear sense of purpose. You know your mission, you know how your work matters, you know you're part of something bigger than yourself. Yes, Jenny Rodriguez agreed. As military police, I felt like I was protecting people every day. My civilian job in corporate security feels so much less meaningful by comparison. David Kim had been quiet during most of the discussion, but now he spoke up. I've been thinking about what Sarah said about knowing how your work matters. In the Army, I knew that if I did my job well, people stayed safe. If I messed up, people could die. That level of responsibility was terrifying, but also gave everything I did incredible weight and meaning. Dr. Walsh facilitated the conversation skillfully, helping each person explore their own experience while connecting to the broader themes. As the discussion continued, Sarah noticed that the new members were becoming more engaged, sharing their own struggles with civilian transition. Marcus Chen talked about the boredom of his current job in corporate IT. I went from disarming bombs to troubleshooting email problems. The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming sometimes. Colonel Hayes discussed the challenge of going from commanding officer to substitute teacher. High school students don't respond to military leadership techniques, she said with a wry smile. I had to completely relearn how to motivate and guide people. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself sharing more details about her military experience than she ever had before. She talked about the intense bonds formed with fellow medical personnel during mass casualty events. She described the satisfaction of successfully treating critical patients under impossible conditions. She shared the grief she carried for the soldiers she hadn't been able to save. Sarah, Frank Williams said during a pause in the conversation, can I ask what led to your discharge? You don't have to answer if you're not comfortable. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering whether to cross this particular line. She had never talked about the injury that ended her career, not even in previous support group meetings. I was injured in Syria, she said finally. Roadside bomb hit our convoy while we were transporting casualties to a higher level of care. I suffered a traumatic brain injury and some other injuries that were significant enough to end my military career. The room fell completely silent. Even Dr. Walsh seemed surprised by this revelation. I'm sorry, Marcus said softly. That must have been devastating, especially since it wasn't your choice to leave. It was, Sarah acknowledged. I had planned to make the military a full career. 20 years minimum, maybe more. Having that choice taken away was almost as difficult as the physical recovery. Mike Peterson, who had become more talkative since their hospital conversation, spoke up. Sarah, do you mind if I ask how you're doing with the TBI? I know several guys who struggle with post-concussion symptoms. Some days are better than others, Sarah replied honestly. I have headaches, some memory issues, occasionally problems with balance. But I was lucky. A lot of people with similar injuries have much more severe long-term effects. Tom Bradley nodded knowingly. The invisible wounds are sometimes the hardest ones to deal with. People can see my missing leg and understand that I was injured, but TBI symptoms are harder for civilians to recognize or understand. That's true, Sarah agreed. And there's sometimes a feeling that you should just push through it, especially when you've seen other people with more visible or severe injuries. The following week brought an unexpected challenge for Sarah. She was working her regular shift at Cedar Falls General Hospital when the emergency department suddenly received word of a multi-vehicle accident on the interstate. A tour bus carrying high school students had collided with two other vehicles, resulting in multiple casualties. Dr. Torres found Sarah restocking supplies in the trauma bay. We're about to receive at least 12 patients, possibly more. Some are critical. I know this isn't your usual assignment, but we could really use someone with your experience in the trauma unit. Sarah felt her heart rate spike immediately. The familiar pre-mission adrenaline was kicking in, but it was mixed with anxiety she hadn't expected. She hadn't worked a mass casualty event since her injury, and she wasn't sure how her brain would handle the stress and rapid decision-making required. Of course, she replied, pushing aside her concerns. People needed help, and that was always her priority. The emergency department transformed into organized chaos within minutes. Additional staff members appeared from other departments. Equipment was moved into position, and the trauma bays were prepared for the incoming wave of patients. The first ambulance arrived carrying a 17-year-old girl with a suspected internal bleeding and possible spinal injury. As Sarah assisted Dr. Torres with the initial assessment, muscle memory took over. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs, establishing IV access, and monitoring the patient's condition. "Sarah, you're doing excellent work," Dr. Torres commented as they worked to stabilize the teenager. "Have you worked mass casualty events before?" "A few," Sarah replied, her attention focused entirely on their patient. The girl was conscious but scared, crying for her mother. Sarah spoke to her in the same calm, reassuring voice she had used with countless soldiers. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Sarah asked while adjusting the IV drip. "Emma," the girl whispered. "Is my mom coming? Are my friends okay?" "Emma, my name is Sarah, and I'm going to take really good care of you. Dr. Torres here is one of the best doctors I've ever worked with. Your mom is on her way, and we're going to check on your friends too, okay?" The familiar rhythm of trauma care felt both comforting and disorienting. Sarah found herself falling into the same focused state she had experienced during her military deployments, where everything outside the immediate medical task faded into background noise. Over the next 4 hours, Sarah assisted with 8 different patients ranging in age from 15 to 67, a bus driver with multiple fractures, 2 teachers with concussions, several students with various injuries from minor cuts to a serious leg fracture that required immediate surgery. During a brief break between patients, Sarah noticed that several of her civilian colleagues were struggling with the emotional weight of treating so many young people. Jessica, one of the newer nurses, was visibly shaken after working with a student who kept asking about his girlfriend. "It's normal to feel overwhelmed," Sarah told Jessica quietly. "These situations are intense, especially when the patients are so young. The important thing is to stay focused on what you can control, which is providing the best medical care possible." "How do you stay so calm?" Jessica asked. "You've been completely steady all night." Sarah paused, realizing that she had been drawing on skills and experience that went far beyond her civilian nursing training. "I've worked in high-stress medical situations before. You learn to compartmentalize to stay focused on the task at hand." Dr. Torres approached them during this conversation. "Sarah, I have to say your performance tonight has been exceptional. You've been anticipating my needs, managing multiple priorities, and staying calm under pressure, in ways that suggest significant trauma experience." Sarah felt the familiar tension of wanting to maintain her privacy while recognizing that her background was becoming harder to hide. "I had some specialized training in my previous work." "Military?" Dr. Torres asked directly. Sarah nodded. "Navy corpsman. 3 deployments." Dr. Torres's expression shifted to one of understanding and respect. "That explains a lot. Combat medics have skills and experience that are incredibly valuable in civilian trauma care. Have you considered working in our trauma department full-time?" The suggestion caught Sarah off guard. She had been content with her regular nursing duties, which felt safer and more predictable than trauma work. But tonight had reminded her of something she had forgotten: how much she valued the intensity and purpose of emergency medical care. "I'd need to think about it," Sarah replied honestly. The last patient was discharged at nearly midnight, and Sarah found herself exhausted but oddly energized. As she changed out of her scrubs, she reflected on how natural it had felt to work in that high-pressure environment again. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Mike Peterson. "Saw the news about the bus accident. Hope you're okay if you were working tonight." Sarah smiled at his thoughtfulness. The support group had created connections that extended beyond their weekly meetings. "Long night, but everyone pulled through," she texted back. "Proud of you," came his immediate reply. The next evening, Sarah arrived at the Veterans Support Group meeting to find an unusual energy in the room. Dr. Walsh approached her immediately. "Sarah, I heard about your work during yesterday's accident. Several people at the hospital mentioned how impressive your performance was." "Word travels fast in a small town," Sarah observed. "It does, and it got me thinking about something. We've been talking about identity transition and finding meaningful work in civilian life. Your experience yesterday suggests that you might have found a way to bridge your military medical experience with civilian healthcare in a very direct way." As the meeting began, Dr. Walsh asked the group to reflect on recent experiences that had helped them connect their military skills with civilian opportunities. Sarah found herself sharing the events of the previous night in more detail than she had planned. "Working that mass casualty event reminded me of why I became a medic in the first place," she told the group. "It wasn't about the adrenaline or the drama. It was about being able to help people during the worst moments of their lives." Tom Bradley leaned forward. "It sounds like you found a way to use your military experience in a civilian context that felt meaningful." "I think I did," Sarah agreed. "For the first time since my discharge, I felt like I was using all of my training and experience to its full potential." Marcus Chen, the former EOD specialist, looked thoughtful. "That's what I've been missing in my civilian job. The sense that my specific skills and training are being utilized in a way that matters." Colonel Hayes nodded. "I've been looking for substitute teaching positions that might let me use my leadership experience more directly. Maybe working with ROTC programs or teaching leadership courses." The conversation continued with various group members exploring ways to better align their current work with their military experience and skills. Sarah realized that her willingness to take on trauma work might represent exactly the kind of identity integration that many veterans were seeking. "Dr. Walsh," Sarah said as the meeting was winding down, "I think I'd like to talk to you privately about something after the session." When the other veterans had left, Sarah and Dr. Walsh remained in the empty community center meeting room. "I've been thinking about what happened at the hospital," Sarah began, "and about our discussions in the group about finding purpose and meaning in civilian work." "Go on," Dr. Walsh encouraged. "I think I've been playing it too safe since my discharge. I've been avoiding situations that reminded me too much of my military service because I was afraid of triggering symptoms or memories that might be difficult to handle." "That's a very common and understandable response," Dr. Walsh replied. "Many veterans avoid situations that might feel too similar to their military experience, Kadaib. But what I realized yesterday is that avoiding those situations also means avoiding the parts of my military experience that were positive and meaningful. The sense of purpose, the ability to use specialized skills, the satisfaction of helping people during critical moments." Dr. Walsh smiled. "That sounds like a significant insight. What are you thinking about doing with that realization?" 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of the expanded Veterans Support Group, which had grown to over 60 members and now met in the high school auditorium. She was wearing her dress blue uniform for the first time since her discharge, having been invited to speak at the group's first annual Community Appreciation event. The transformation in her life had been remarkable. She had accepted the full-time position in the trauma department at Cedar Falls General Hospital, where she had quickly become known as one of the most skilled and calm emergency medical professionals on staff. More importantly, she had found a way to integrate her military experience with her civilian career in a way that felt authentic and meaningful. "When I first started attending this support group 8 months ago," Sarah began, addressing the audience of veterans, their families, and community members, "I thought my goal was to forget about my military service and blend into civilian life as seamlessly as possible." She paused, looking out at the familiar faces in the front rows. Mike Peterson sat with his wife Amanda, both of them smiling encouragingly. Tom Bradley had brought his new girlfriend, a veteran herself who had started attending the group. Colonel Hayes was there with several high school ROTC students she had been mentoring. I believed that the healthiest approach was to put my military experience behind me and start fresh. I was wrong about that, and I'm grateful to this community for helping me understand why. Dr. Walsh, who was retiring from her role as group facilitator, watched from the side of the stage with obvious pride. Sarah had agreed to take over leadership of the group, combining it with her hospital work to create a comprehensive support network for veterans in the region. What I learned here is that our military experiences, even the difficult ones, are part of who we are. They don't have to define us completely, but denying them or hiding from them doesn't serve us well either. Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The previous month, she had been featured in a medical journal article about the value of military medical experience in civilian trauma care. More importantly, she had helped establish a veteran peer support program at the hospital, where former military medical personnel provided guidance and understanding to veterans receiving treatment. I also learned that vulnerability and strength aren't opposites. For years, I thought that being strong meant handling everything alone, never asking for help, never showing weakness. Military culture can sometimes reinforce that belief. Several veterans in the audience nodded in recognition. But what I discovered in this group is that sharing our experiences, supporting each other, and being honest about our struggles actually requires tremendous strength. And it makes all of us stronger. Sarah's voice caught slightly as she continued. Some of you know that I served as a Navy corpsman in combat zones for 3 deployments. What you might not know is that for months after joining this group, I was too afraid to share those experiences because I thought they were too intense or too different from what others had been through. Mike Peterson spoke up from the audience. And we're all grateful that you found the courage to open up. Your willingness to share your story gave the rest of us permission to be more honest about our own experiences. That's exactly my point, Sarah replied. We all have something valuable to offer each other, regardless of our specific military roles or experiences. The Army mechanic who held a dying Marine's hand has as much wisdom and strength to share as anyone else in this room. The applause that followed was warm and sustained. Sarah had become not just a leader in the group, but a bridge between the military and civilian communities in Cedar Falls. Her work at the hospital had helped other veterans find meaningful employment in healthcare, while her leadership of the support group had expanded its reach and impact. I want to share something with you that happened last week, Sarah continued. We received a patient at the hospital who was a young veteran struggling with PTSD and substance abuse. He had overdosed and was in critical condition. The room became very quiet. While we were treating him, he regained consciousness and became agitated. He was confused and scared, and the medical team was having trouble calming him down. I was able to connect with him by sharing that I was also a veteran, and that I understood some of what he was going through. Sarah paused, remembering the young man's face when he realized he wasn't alone. He asked me if things ever got better, if the nightmares and the guilt ever went away. I told him what I wish someone had told me earlier. They don't go away completely, but they become manageable. And you don't have to manage them alone. Dr. Walsh stepped forward. That young man, by the way, has now been sober for 3 weeks and has started attending our support group meetings. Sometimes one person's willingness to be vulnerable can save another person's life. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. Which brings me to why I wanted to speak to you all tonight. This community, this group, has given me something I didn't know I was missing. Not just support for my own healing, but the opportunity to turn my experiences into something helpful for others. She looked around the auditorium, taking in the faces of people who had become like family to her. I've learned that healing isn't a destination you reach and then you're done. It's an ongoing process, and it's much more effective when you're not trying to do it alone. I've also learned that our military experiences, even the traumatic ones, can become sources of strength and wisdom if we're willing to examine them honestly and share them appropriately. Tom Bradley raised his hand. Sarah, what advice would you give to veterans who are still struggling to find their place in civilian life? Sarah considered the question carefully. First, be patient with yourself. The transition takes time and everyone's journey is different. Second, don't try to do it alone. Find people who understand what you've been through, whether that's other veterans, family members, or professional counselors. She paused, thinking about her own journey. Third, don't write off your military experience as something you need to get over or move past. Those experiences, skills, and perspectives have value in civilian life. The challenge is finding ways to apply them that feel meaningful and authentic. Marcus Chen, who had recently started a nonprofit organization focused on veteran employment, stood up. Sarah, you've shown us that it's possible to integrate military experience with civilian careers in really powerful ways. That's inspired a lot of us to think differently about our own transitions. That's wonderful to hear, Sarah replied. But remember that my path won't be the right path for everyone. The goal isn't to replicate what I've done, but to find your own way to honor your service while building a fulfilling civilian life. As the evening wound down, Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this place. The scared, isolated woman who had first walked into the support group meeting 8 months earlier seemed like a different person. She thought about Lance Corporal Roberto Martinez, whose death had haunted Mike Peterson for so long, and whose story had ultimately helped both of them heal. She thought about the hundreds of soldiers she had treated during her deployments, and how their faces had motivated her to keep pushing forward, even during her darkest moments. "Before we close," Sarah said, "I want to say something to the family members and community supporters here tonight. Your veterans need your patience, your understanding, and your support. But they also need you to see them as whole people, not just as their military service or their struggles." Amanda Peterson wiped away tears as she applauded. "We are more than our uniforms, more than our deployments, more than our injuries or our trauma. We are your neighbors, your colleagues, your friends, and your family members. We have skills, perspectives, and experiences that can contribute to our communities in meaningful ways." Sarah stepped back from the podium as the audience rose in a standing ovation. But what moved her most wasn't the applause. It was seeing the faces of veterans who had found their voice, their purpose, and their community. The room went silent, in the best possible way, filled not with the silence of isolation and secrets, but with the silence of understanding, acceptance, and hope. Sarah Martinez had finally found her way home.